Here is a green ink by Sailor Studio 867.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
A very light green that has tons of tone variation by pen, giving 5 different shades of this ink. All are good, so it isn't something to be concerned about. It does shade in all 5 tones of this ink, and again, this isn't a big deal as they all shade well, but some certainly better than others. I like that I can ink up every pen with this, and it's going to give a slightly different green from every pen, truly keeping you on your toes in a good way. I do enjoy a good green ink, and this is a great one. I think my favorite of the Studio line so far.
The pen for today is a Kaweco Sport. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, this is our lightest tone, and yet it's still very easy to read, even though I'm calling it a lighter green. This is beautiful on the page. There's no feathering, there's no spread. The shading is doing a great job. Even though it shades at times, look at the top of the L's where it gets really, really light. But the downstroke of, all on Golem on the first line, sorry, on the downstroke on the G gets very dark. The amount of shading that's going on is really, this is that camouflage shading that I tend to enjoy so much. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is infinitely darker than it was with the soft fine nib. It starts out so dark, it's I want to say almost black, but definitely never black. It does sort of even up halfway through the second line. The pen did sit for a couple of days before I used it, so it got a bit darker there. Now, we get no feathering, we get no spread. Looking at line 3 and 4, we're getting very decent shading the whole way through. I mean, again, to look at Bilbo, third line, we get darker and lighter tones all in the one word. Where a queer look, we tend to see A starts darker, gets lighter. Queer starts darker, gets lighter, darkens up just a bit into the E's. And look starts dark, gets light at the O's, darkens again at the K. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit lighter than it was with the wet fine nib, darker than it was with the soft fine. No feathering, no spread. It is shading very well, and it's really this really gentle in and out. So when you spot your darker letters, start looking around. Look at "and" on the first line. The D is quite a bit darker, and when you track it backwards, it's really lightening up very gently through the word, where "the" goes lighter to darker in a much more abrupt manner. Hobbit on the second line starts a bit darker, lightens up just a little bit in the middle, and darkens up quite a bit at the T again. The broad nib is just a tad bit darker than it was with the medium, just the slightest bit. No feathering, no spread, great tone on the page, really crisp as a tone. It's refreshing as green goes. It's kind of like what would have been seen with, I think it was, not the same kind of green, but refreshing feel of it as I think it was Robert Oster's Lemongrass. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get very nice shading. It is just as pronounced as it was with the medium. I think the thicker lines are helping it some, just because you see a little more clearly. It's nice. Look at questions on the first line. The Q starts lighter, gets darker into the bottom of the Q, lightens up on its way up, darker first part of the U, lightens up on the second part of the U, then starts getting very dark, lightens up at the T, and then gets very dark again at the S. The amount of shading that's going back and forth, really, that camouflage shading, beautiful. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get shading, beautiful shading all the way through on this non-fountain pen friendly paper that is ignored by the community, so I hope to draw some attention to it with these videos. Look at Had. The shading that's going on in Had on the first line, darker to lighter to darker at the end of the D. Wanted directly underneath it. Lighter to darker all the way through, but even in the lighter areas, while it is mostly one tone, when you look at the W, you see that the second part of the W is just a bit darker. It's very nice. And how directly underneath that, dark, shading its way down into a lighter tone in the W. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine nib, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, also more uniform as a tone than the Clairfontaine. Now, we get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get some shading. Not real standout, definitely there though, where on the first line starts lighter, gets much darker at the H, lightens up and darkens up again at the last E. Got underneath it, the G has nice midtones through most of it, darker in the bottom of the G, lighter in the O, very dark at the T. Really doing such a nice job. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit lighter than it was with the wet fine nib, little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get very nice shading, not the kind of shading you tend to expect on non-fountain pen friendly paper, and we're definitely getting it here, and lots of it. Truth be told, look at told on the third line. Look at the amount of tone variation that is going on in one little word. Ignore the fact that my cross of the T missed the T and hit the L. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the medium, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with the shading you should be aware of. Looking at aware on the second line, where it starts lighter and becomes darker. L-Rod on the first line, the E is a bit darker than the L, which is lighter than the R, and the Rond stays lighter until the end of the D. So lots of shading happening here. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is just a tad bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine, a brighter, livelier green as a result of this paper. No feather, no spread, great shading throughout all of it. I think it's shading much, much better than it did on the Clairefontaine. The tone of this paper is really helping it out. Just look at just any one word, really, but take a look at, let's say, come out on the second line. That starts lighter, works its way darker in both words, really showing off all of the variation of tone that this ink has. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get shading, and the shading I think is showing up very nice. A lot of what I'm seeing for shading here is as you're writing, it's going from a darker tone and it's working its way lighter, which makes me think what I saw in the Clairefontaine with it being much darker and working its way lighter there is more a matter of as you're writing with this pen, if the feed can keep up. So if you have a wetter fine where the feed can keep up, you would probably expect that much darker tone the whole way through. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we still keep the shading. This paper is doing such a great job. This ink is such it's really a joy to use. Look at Dwarves on the second line. Doesn't look like it has a ton of tone variations, but the D and the beginning of the W are a bit darker. It lightens up just a little bit till you're coming into the V. It darkens some and the S gets much darker. Same thing happens on because just beneath that. So it's really showing it well, and not, people that aren't fountain pen users may not really notice this as a standout thing, but I think fountain pen users will see it because we're a little more used to seeing it. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the medium, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, brighter in tone. We do get feathering. I see it on the I and must, first two words on the first line. When you get to the third line, I see it on it. I see it on decent on the second line. So there's some feathering going on. There is a tiny little bit of spread. I'm not seeing this as a huge deal. It's not distracting, but it is definitely there. Shading, still there, not shading anywhere near as it did on the Clairefontaine, but it definitely is shading quite well. If on the first line, which also has some feathering, does show a much darker tone compared to I right next to it. Now, I right next to it shows nice mid and darker tones. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we don't really get much for ghosting. You could probably write on the back of this page without much difficulty. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left. Pen flush is on the top right. 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shading just as well as on the Clairefontaine. Now, with this being a lighter tone here, the vertical lines of this quad rule are a little bit distracting to the writing, meaning that this tone with this style of a paper isn't necessarily the best option. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. All of it is lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. No feathering, no spread. Really, the shading here is much better than it did on the Clairefontaine, just looking at them side by side. But look at Goblins on the second line, where you get all of these lighter and darker tones together in one word without any kind of a problem. Now, the fact that it's much darker here, the vertical lines are not a distraction to what's going on. You can kind of phase them out of your view because the ink's dark enough. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine. Strange, I know, because we've gotten so many different tone variations. Quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread. It shades really well the whole way through. The most noticeable thing for me is take a look at followed on the first line. When you see the F crosses the vertical and horizontal lines, you see that the ink gets broken up a little bit. So this ink is not penetrating through the ink that was put on the page. Even on edge, on the third line, first word, you see it happen again, and it's a very noticeable thing, kind of distracting in what's going on. Hall on the third line, again, when the vertical or horizontal lines come, it breaks up the ink a little bit, making me just a little bit disappointed here. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the medium, a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shading as well as it was on the Clairfontaine. We still have the same problem with the ink becoming a little broken up with the lines on the page, like best on the first line, the upstroke of the B, you see it where it crosses that and it's just out there on their own, and it drew my attention immediately. Same with shadows. The D and that vertical line broke it some, so it's not penetrating as well as I would hope, meaning that, you know, the Clairfontaine or the Rhodia paper that's quad rule, not necessarily a great option for this ink. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Aurora Green.
Here is Delta Green. Here is Noodler's USS Texas. Here is Robert Oster Light Green. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Flatter, duller as a tone. No feather, no spread, shades very well. Look at study on the second line, and you see that it goes light in the S, dark in the T, lightens up, but then darkens up again at the DY. The shading's very nice. Something else really noticeable here, and it's going to be a spoiler for in the future, but the ink is not breaking up on the vertical and horizontal lines. And here, because of the duller tone of the page, it actually isn't as bad, but the vertical lines are still a little bit distracting with this nib. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit lighter than quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get very nice shading. Look at Midsummer, first line, starts lighter, gets darker at the I, lightens up into the D, dark at the top of the D, lightens up again through summer until you get to the ER at the end where it starts to darken up a bit. Noticeably, again, the vertical lines are not breaking up the ink, so it's bonding all the way through, and the vertical lines can really disappear into the background. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine nib. lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with a nice shading. Look at the first line, lighter, working its way darker all the way through. Now, the shading is not always huge in words. For instance, if you looked at known on the third line, it's a mid-tone, lightens to, it goes to its lighter tones on the OW and back to the mid-tone on N. Once again, the vertical lines, not a problem here, doing very good things. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. So with this paper, we're getting some of its most consistent tone. This tone is the same tone that we saw with the soft fine on this paper. No feathering, no spread, shades very well. Look at mountains, how beautiful that is. The M's are darker, the OU gets lighter, the N is a nice mid-tone. The T has a mid-tone at the top, but dark tone at the bottom. I think this is a great ink for students to use, especially with the fact that, again, this is not getting broken up on the vertical and horizontal lines. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements this color on the page. Here is Robert Oster NG Special. Here is a purple ink by Diamine Damson. Here is a black ink by Mont Blanc Ultra Black. Here is a red ink by Ackerman, their number 18. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. It does feather, it does spread, it does bring some shading. I think what we're seeing here, while it's not my favorite, because I don't care for 20-pound copy paper, I think what we're seeing is usable in many situations if you wanted to use it. I wouldn't. It's 20-pound copy paper, but if you wanted to, I think you could. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. We get lots of feathering, lots of spread. It's more than the medium was on the Clairefontaine, not quite to the broad from the Clairefontaine. We get shading. And I mean, they on the first line starts very dark and works its way lighter into the Y. It's there. It's gross. Don't do this one. Just no, don't do it. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than on the Clairefontaine. We get feathering, we get spread. I think what we're seeing here is much more manageable than we saw with the wet fine nib. I like this one much more if you have to use copy paper than I did with the wet fine. So that medium here is very nice. Now, does it shade? Yes, as in I can find some areas that are a little bit darker, like doubly on the second line. The LY is a little bit darker. Laugh directly underneath it. The GHE and beginning of the D, darker than the rest of the word. I think this is an acceptable version of this ink considering the paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium. Very, very close to what we had on the Clairefontaine. Just a tiniest bit darker with no feathering. No. Of course it has feathering. With no spread? No. Of course it has spread. The feathering and the spread are a manageable condition in this case, a condition I don't accept, so I wouldn't use it. It does have some shading. You see great on the first line, the R and the end of the T, Darker, that's great for them or whoever wants to use it here. Looking at the page underneath, we see that we do get bleed spots on the broad, the medium, and the wet fine, but not the soft fine. Now, when we see the back of the page, I don't think you could write back here unless you wanted to destroy both sets of what you were writing.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
A lighter tone from a dry fine with a good shading. Very dark green with some shading from a wet fine, and midtones with consistent ombre shading in the medium flow medium pen, or a lighter tone with a generous peppering of shading from the broad. Which one's for me? Well, I preferred the look of the medium flow medium nib because of the ombre shading that was going on. It was great mid-tone. Again, there's so slight variation in the tone that I don't think it's really bad for a pen. Just me, that medium flow, medium nib is a standout way to go.
This is the end, and thanks for watching.